Hi, my name is Karen Janowsky, and on behalf of the Write Women's Book Festival, thank you for joining me. We're going to be talking about writing fight scenes and action scenes today. If you want to find out more about the festival, you can go to www.writewomenbookfest.org. So I'm the author of a trilogy of superhero romance novels for adults called The Persistence of Memory. And those are available on Amazon and Kindle Unlimited due to the nature of the combined genres. There are several fight scenes and love scenes in the books, and today I'm going to share with you what I know about them. So first, let's look at what the two have in common. First, they're action scenes. That means that rather than being static or being dialogue driven, these scenes have a lot of movement in them, and they need a certain pace and momentum to make them work. Second, when the scenes work well, it's because in the story they're inevitable. The author has built up enough tension and created the right circumstances to make either the fight or the sex the most realistic, viable option. Third, the action in the scenes are sequential. In other words, the order in which things happen is chronological. Fourth, the scenes evoke emotion. When we write scenes that are fraught and full of movement, we want the reader to be invested in what's happening. We want them to feel compelled to keep reading through the scene's resolution. To that end, just as in real life fights and real life sex, technique is important. These scenes generally require a particular writing skill set, background knowledge, and planning. And finally, and most importantly, fight scenes and sex scenes are really about something other than the action taking place. There's some kind of subtext, whether it be thematic, plot-driven, or character arc-driven. If those deeper elements aren't there, the scenes tend to fall flat, or at very least, they become unmemorable. Before we discuss the specifics of writing fight scenes and sex scenes, I want to go over some of the techniques that are universal to writing both. Regardless of the scene, even if it isn't part of the story, you as the writer need to know the circumstances surrounding the character's presence. In other words, where was the character and what was she doing right before this moment? She probably didn't just show up somewhere and suddenly decide to put herself in a predicament where she has to make some kind of decision to fight. And unless there's some kind of mind control or other genre at play, she can't be absolutely certain whether sex is going to happen, even if she planned a seduction. So it's good to know what her mood was just before she got there and why she is in this place now. To that end, it's important to set the scene. Characters don't have fights or sex in a space devoid of any environment whatsoever. It's a good idea to paint the picture for the reader. This helps set the tone, and it also gives readers a better understanding of the character's perspective. What does she see, and why would she notice these particular things? If you take a look at the picture on the side here, we have ruins of some sort. There are people who are either hurt or maybe dead on the ground, and your character doesn't take everything in at once. So find out what she focuses on first. What gets her attention and why? From there, be able to show how this environment affects her mood. Also, as she notices things, you might consider planting objects that can either help or hinder her objective in the scene. You don't necessarily have to be obvious about it, and it doesn't have to occur right away what she might use it for. But for example, if she notices large broken branches on the ground and undead figures beginning to attack, she can grab a branch as a makeshift weapon. In order to make sense for her to do that, though, we need to have seen it for her to be aware that these things are there. So because these are action scenes, we know ahead of time that they're going to have a particular shape. You've probably seen the classic upside-down checkmark diagram of a story before, and an action scene is a miniature version of that kind of story. As you look at it, notice that the longest part of the scene is the rising tension. Eventually, that tension will get to the point where there's no chance of turning back, and something is going to have to be done. As you can see, the catalyst for action and the climax itself are very short. In fact, the second longest part of the scene is really the falling action and then the resolution, as opposed to the main event. So sex and fight scenes have particular language in common as well. So first, action scenes go by very quickly. So the pacing of the scenes should be very deliberate. We want to give the illusion of things happening and escalating quickly, at least in fight scenes. In sex scenes, sometimes we can go more slowly, but there also needs to be some kind of quickening cadence as well. To do this, technique is to use short sentences. That isn't to say they should be simple and choppy, but they need to be brief, and the transitions need to be clear. It's also important to avoid cliches, which is something most of us struggle with, at least from time to time. If a reader comes upon language they've seen dozens of times before, they're going to start to check out, and they might start skimming since they can already expect what's going to happen. They can anticipate it since they've seen it before. Keep the language as fresh as you can for that reason. And also focus on things that are a little unusual, like small details. But again, try to do so relatively quickly. These can include things like sensory details. And the more senses you're able to incorporate most of the time, the better. Also, use modifiers like adjectives and adverbs very sparingly, if at all. Modifiers tend to be vague, and descriptors mean different things to different people, and much of the time they're a way of cheating the writing. Anytime you catch yourself using one, think about a more specific, sensory, or concrete way to convey meaning. Onomatopoeic language is language that phonetically imitates a sound. Essentially, they're sound effects, but in writing. And sometimes these can be very effective. But as with modifiers, use them sparingly, otherwise they can overwhelm the reader and they lose track of what's really happening because that language is so attention-getting. Again, sensory and physical detail usually have more impact than onomatopoeic words, and often also less camp. Another way writers sometimes cheat is by using italics, boldface, or capital letters to emphasize dialogue or action. Remember, the goal of the action scene is to have a strong impact on the reader. So don't let the typeface or a font steal that narrative moment away from you. Don't let the font take control of your vision. In other words, when we talk about language and we talk about technique, we're really talking about details. It's the small details that differentiate your style from others most of the time. So again, make sure we're seeing the scene through the point of view character's eyes. The scene sets the mood, and that's the emotional basis of the scene that's about to come. Again, the scene also establishes characterization. We don't all perceive and interpret the same things about the world, even if we're all looking at the same thing. So setting the scene concretely gives readers indirect insight into the kind of person that character is. And to accomplish this, focus on those imperfections and oddities as well as the basics. For example, the character enters that earlier scene among the ruins and can't stop staring at one particular statue of a man whose face is worn away with age and is missing his hands. Another character might notice how still the air has become, and so on. In other words, readers see the world you've created through the character's eyes. So focusing on those kinds of details make that world more distinct and more memorable. Also, try to avoid dialogue in these scenes for the sake of pacing. Think of it this way: in a fight, in a real one, what happens if you start up a conversation in the middle of the action as you try to parry your opponent? Probably you're using more energy than you should. You are paying more attention to, or at least as much attention to what you're saying as you are to what's happening. And that dialogue gives the opponent a chance to strike. During sex, it's kind of the same thing. You probably don't want your partner to start discussing what they're doing in detail. The conversation diminishes focus on sensory experience, and in sex scenes, that's primarily what we're going for. So in both these cases, the momentum and the pacing is interrupted when you start bringing dialogue into the communication. Keep the communication to body language if possible. The same thing works for asides and thought processes, like comparing one time to another, or think what that character might think of the other character in the scene, and so on. They don't belong in action scenes for that same reason. Again, the character's mind is elsewhere, and they aren't concentrating on the issue at hand. In addition to that, again, the pacing is interrupted and the momentum is slowed or sometimes stopped. Now, there are exceptions to these rules. One exception, if you recall, the movie is The Princess Bride. And there's some rather masterful and witty dialogue between Wesley and Inigo the first time they duel. That can work really well in some cases, but you need to have a very firm control of language to do that, and a very firm idea of how that scene is going to be choreographed. My suggestion is to try to avoid it, because we are not all Rob Reiner and we are not all William Golding, and we don't necessarily write that way. So moving on, let's talk about fight scenes. Whether it's an all-out fist fight in an alleyway, or a sword duel in a castle, or a battle during a war, we treat them all the same way. So far, we've touched on how important it is for you as the author to know what brought the characters to this point. If you, as the author, have context, you can reveal at least some of it as the tension of the scene mounts. Fights don't come out of nowhere usually. In addition to describing the scene, another way to ground the reader is to give context to the situation. We've discussed the idea that steady building of tension is vital to an effective action scene, and now we're ready to move on to the mechanics of the fight itself. Remember, the most important part of the fight happens prior to the fight, and we're gradually building up tension. First, something is introduced that's going to cause some kind of friction. And the tension gradually builds up until it gets to the point where there's a trigger. And from that trigger comes the violence, and then the falling action, the refraction that comes afterwards, as well as the resolution. The two most important things to remember when we write these fight scenes is that the actions have to make sense logically. So they need to be written in order. And this is true in sex scenes as well, where the sequential order and active rather than passive voice become very, very important. So let's take a look here. We have Kathy fell, and that's pretty straightforward. That's an action, she fell. When Sheila hit her is passive voice, and the sequence is out of order. As a reader, the first thing we see is the sentence, Kathy fell, and then we see the cause of it afterwards. So we want cause effect in the right order and sequence. So if we try this again and we add a little detail, we can have Sheila pulling back a fist at first, and that adds a little bit more tension because we can anticipate what's going to happen next, and slammed it into Kathy's solar plexus. So what we've done here now is used a stronger verb than hit. She slams it, and she slams it into a very particular body part in the center of her abdomen. And the consequence is Kathy gasps. And when she gasps, then she falls backward. And we add that she's fallen backward because that might influence what happens next, where she moves and how she moves. So in the physiology of a fight scene, once we have the basic structure in place, we can start bringing other elements into the scene so that they all work together. Sequential order, cause and effect, and detailed language combine and create the scene's purpose, which is to elicit emotion in the reader, to heighten it. So let's bring Kathy and Sheila back for a more complete fight. Sheila pulled back her fist and slammed it into Kathy's solar plexus. Move my screen a little bit. Kathy huffed as the air left her body. So we've added even more detail now, a stronger word than gasp, and we've created some motion to go with it. We've added another verb. She stumbled and fell backward. So now instead of just falling back as soon as she's hit, she staggers a little bit. We see the movement of her in the action of falling before she actually hits the ground and lands on her arm. As a consequence of her landing on her arm, dirt and gravel scraped and punctured her hand and face. She tasted gritty blood as she inhaled and wheezed. So now we have sensory language as well. We can almost feel, more or less, what she is feeling. We know that grit and blood don't taste or feel good. So we know she's hurt without having to just say she's hurt. But the scene isn't over yet. Sheila stormed toward her and lifted her leg. She brought it down. So we see increments of a kick that's about to happen. We see her acting very deliberately. This would be different than saying she ran over and swung her leg out, for example. So this tells us what the action is like. But Kathy rolled over onto her side, and Sheila missed the kick. But Kathy's head throbbed and her palm stung. Her lips felt puffy. We have a consequence now. And from there, we would have some resolution. We've created some language to heighten the scene. And think about how the characters might be feeling after that fight. So Kathy's probably going to be in pain for a while, but still she might also be in fight or flight mode. She doesn't know what Sheila's going to do next. All is going to depend on how Sheila acts. And Sheila may or may not be satisfied with having hurt Kathy, and she might continue to posture or threaten. She might try to kick her or beat her up some more. Or she might laugh at her. Any number of things can happen. But the tension eventually is going to come down a little bit at a time. It doesn't just come to a hard stop. And moving on from there, the same thing is true for sex. The same basic rules of language apply here, except the pace might be a bit slower. By employing sequential order and cause and effect alongside sensory detail, you'll still create a sense of immediacy. Just as when you write a fight scene, you want the reader to be agitated and keep turning pages. In a sex scene, you might also want the reader to linger a bit, though. So we still need to figure out a way to maintain the pace and continue to raise tension. Of all the kinds of scenes authors create, sex scenes are the most sensitive, I think, to the degree of attention and length of the scene. So to decide how long you're going to make this scene, first of all, figure out what kind of a book you're writing. If you're writing a sweet romance, the scene is going to be a very different length than if you're writing erotica, for example. Or if you're not writing a romance at all and you just happen to have a sex scene in there, again, the size of that scene will really depend on how you're writing the rest of the story. You should also think about context. Why are the characters having sex? It needs to make sense to the reader. And there also needs to be some subtext. So again, these scenes are really about something else. We don't know why earlier Kathy and Sheila were fighting, but clearly Sheila was pissed off and Kathy was taken by surprise. So we know that there's a communication issue going on between the two. The same kind of subtext applies here. What's really going on between the characters? So what we want to develop to get that subtext is, first of all, chemistry between the two characters. And we do that with dialogue and with body language. The things it helps to know ahead of writing are, first of all, how detailed do you want to get? Again, that's going to depend somewhat on what kind of book you're writing and on what's appropriate for your characters. It might not be the right kind of character that's going to go through a prolonged sex scene. Or maybe this is a character that is the kind of person that pays a lot of attention to detail, and you need to slow it down and go step by step even more. The other thing to keep in mind as you develop the pacing is, if you were watching this as a movie, at what point would you want to scream, "Just do it already"? That's the point you want to get to before we get to the actual sex. So also, there are a few common traps that writers fall into when we create sex scenes. They can go on for too long, which, if the pacing is too slow, might bore the reader and cause them to skim. On the other hand, they might go on for too long, and the reader will either be unsatisfied or confused about what just happened and why. Of any kind of scene I've read, sex scenes are the most prone to exaggeration, cliche, and silly language or euphemisms. So pay close attention to what the character's perspective is here. What kind of language would they use if they were thinking about or narrating the scene themselves? Usually, simple is best when describing body parts in various sex acts. You'll want to try to avoid a situation where your euphemism might make people laugh or cringe rather than stay in the scene's mood. The language ought to be unobtrusive so that the reader continues to visualize what's happening, not get caught up on strange or unusual language. Romance is also one of the more trope-driven genres. It's hard to avoid them with this genre, and that can be okay. What we need to do, though, is not depend on the genre. It's okay to have it there. Know the trope you're starting with. For example, first time between two inexperienced lovers, and put your own unique spin on it. This is where fresh language is very, very important. Another trap I often see is that the sex is unvaryingly, mind-blowingly fantastic, and the characters climax at the same time, or one has enough control over their body to wait for the other one to come first. And we all know that this is fiction within fiction. Elbows jab into shoulders. It's not always going to feel and look like a beautiful choreographed moment. Holes can be missed. Kisses can get drooly. Or an experienced partner who thinks they know exactly how to satisfy their new partner might be completely wrong and have totally the wrong skill set at first, so that their styles are incompatible. This is another area where focusing on small details, the weird shape of the lover's mouth, for example, can make that scene uniquely yours. Take your time with them. The most common problem with sex scenes, though, is lack of context. Ask yourself whether the scene really needs to be there. What is it doing for the story? And if the sex has to happen, does it need to happen on camera? And if so, why? You should be able to explain that to yourself, even if you don't make that an explanation that you bring into the book. And again, we're going for subtext here. Sex is absolutely about the action, but it's also about the emotion, and it needs to be about some larger issue that will deepen our understanding of the character or underscore a plot theme, or in best of all cases, all of those things. So the same principles basically apply in sex scenes as they do in fight scenes. Context and setting are important to establish the perspective and mood. From there, the pacing of tension becomes a priority. And from there comes a point where there's no turning back. The sex is going to happen. We have the act itself, and then there's falling action and resolution to the scene. So I've got two examples of sex scenes that I believe work very well. One is an older work published in 1928 from Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, and the other is a more contemporary example. In both, I've broken them down in sections, so in the same manner as that upside down check mark, so that you can see the pacing. So first we set the scene. The keeper, squatting beside her, was also watching with an amused face the bold little bird in her hands. Suddenly he saw a tear fall onto her wrist, and he stood up and stood away, moving to the other coop, for suddenly he was aware of the old flame shooting and leaping up in his loins that he had hoped was quiescent forever. He fought against it, turning his back to her, but it leapt and leapt downward, circling in his knees. He turned again to look at her. She was kneeling and holding her two hands slowly forward, blindly, so that the chicken should run into the mother hen again. And there was something so mute and forlorn in her, compassion flamed in his bowels for her. So nothing's happened yet. We have set the stage essentially here. We know what the mood is. We know that she's feeling some kind of despondency or sadness. We know that he's feeling attracted and also sensitive to her mood. So from there we begin the tension. Without knowing, he came quickly towards her and crouched beside her again, taking the chick from her hands because she was afraid of the hen, and putting it back in the coop. At the back of his loins, the fire suddenly darted stronger. He glanced apprehensively at her. Her face was averted, and she was crying blindly in all anguish of her generation's forlornness. His heart melted suddenly, like a drop of fire, and he put out his hand and laid his fingers on her knee. "You shouldn't cry," he said softly. So now we've set the stage for tension to rise, but then she put her hands over her face and felt that really her heart was broken and nothing mattered anymore. He laid his hand on her shoulder and softly, gently, it began to travel down the curve of her back, blindly, with a blind stroking motion to curve her crouching loins. And there his hand softly, softly stroked the curve of her flank in the blind, instinctive caress. She had found her scrap of handkerchief and was blindly trying to dry her face. "Shall you come to the hut?" he said in a quiet, neutral voice. Well, now there's a decision that she has to make. And given that she's fairly sensitive to what he's doing to her, he's not really doing anything sexual, but it is intimate, we get to a crisis point. And closing his hand, I can't see. There we go. And closing his hand around hers, he led her slowly to the hut, not letting go of her till she was inside. Then he cleared aside the chair and table and took a brown soldier's blanket from the tool chest, spreading it slowly. She glanced at his face as she stood motionless. His face was pale and without expression, like that of a man submitting to fate. "You lie there," he said softly, and he shut the door so that it was dark, quite dark. With a queer obedience, she lay down on the blanket. Then she felt the soft, groping, helplessly desirous hand touching her body, feeling for her face. The hand stroked her face softly, with infinite soothing and assurance, and at last there was the soft touch of a kiss on her cheek. So if this were to turn around now and they didn't have sex after all, it would be confusing to the reader because everything they've read so far has led up to the implication that the sex is going to happen, which is why we want that crisis point. It has to feel like, okay, nothing else can possibly happen at this point. And then we get to the actual sex scene, and you'll notice here that this is a pretty short part of the scene. She lay quite still in a sort of sleep, in a sort of dream. Then she quivered as she felt his hand groping softly, yet with queer thwarted clumsiness among her clothing. Yet the hand knew too how to enclose her where it wanted. He drew down the thin silk sheath slowly, carefully, right down and over her feet. Then with a quiver of exquisite pleasure, he touched the warm, soft body and touched her navel for a moment in a kiss. And he had come into her at once to enter the peace on earth of her soft, quiescent body. It was the moment of pure peace for him, the entry into the body of the woman. She lay still in a kind of sleep, always in a kind of sleep. The activity, the orgasm was all his. She could strive for herself no more. Even the tightness of his arms round her, even the intense movement of his body and the springing of his seed in her was a kind of sleep from which she did not begin to rouse till he had finished and lay softly panting against her breath. So even this is sequential, and there's a lot of sensory detail here. And there's also a lot of action here. There isn't a lot by way of adverbs and adjectives. There's a little bit. But he uses these words very deliberately. D.H. Lawrence was also a poet, so he was very particular about the placement and arrangement of words. And finally, we have the falling action. Then she wondered, just dimly wondered why. Why was this necessary? Why had it lifted a great cloud from her and given her peace? Was it real? Was it real? Her tormented modern woman's brain still had no rest. Was it real? And she knew if she gave herself to the man, it was real. But if she kept herself for herself, it was nothing. She was old, millions of years old, she felt. And at last, she could bear the burden of herself no more. She was to be had for the taking. To be had for the taking. The man lay in a mysterious stillness. What was he feeling? What was he thinking? She did not know. He was a strange man to her. She did not know him. She must only wait, for she did not dare break his mysterious stillness. He lay there with his arms round her, his body on hers, his wet body touching hers, so close and completely unknown, yet not unpeaceful. His very stillness was peaceful. She knew that when at last he roused and drew away from her, it was like an abandonment. He drew her dress in the darkness down over her knees and stood a few moments, apparently adjusting his own clothing. Then he quietly opened the door and went out. So we have a definite beginning, middle, and end here. And it's a definite slow progression to that high point and a slow denouement back down again. So what is this scene really about? Well, we can infer from here Connie, the female character's sense of emptiness and lack of tenderness in her life. We get this from the way she acted with that chick. We get this from the way she questioned whether or not she should have allowed him to give her an orgasm, whether or not she should have been so passive about it. She isn't sure what to make of her body. She can barely stand it. We also get Oliver's own sense of emptiness in his life, the male character. We get it because we know he was trying to resist at first. He didn't want to feel the level of attraction that he did, but he couldn't help it. And that he felt a sense of peace when they were actually having sex. It was suddenly a quiet, serene moment for him, which, since it had to be pointed out, probably meant he isn't used to that kind of serenity. We also very clearly get here that the scene is about the need for human connection. These are two people that have a kind of absence in their life, and they have found each other to the point where when they part again and he stands up, she feels abandoned once more. So really, what this whole novel is about in part is that sex is instinctual and natural. And this is underscored just in these few paragraphs. This was an inevitable thing to happen because of the way they were feeling and the situation they were in. So the other example I want to give you is from my own book. This is The Persistence of Memory Part 2, All Our Yesterdays. And it starts by setting the scene. They returned to their room, closed the door, and Daniel collapsed in Nina's arms. A cloud of dust and a few spider webs strands flew up in a small cloud around their faces. She supported his weight and rocked him. He didn't resist, he just shook. She stroked his filmy hair and held him until his shaking subsided enough for him to stand properly. So we have the scene now. We can also make some inferences from this scene about their mood. Daniel is upset, he's devastated. Something happened that was not pleasant. We know this because of the spider web clouds and the dust. We know that he's exhausted, probably emotionally, because she's not just supporting his weight, she's rocking him. And then we start to create some tension. Nina unzipped the front and sides of Daniel's Lionheart costume. He stood still and let her peel it from his shoulders, down his arms, and over his hips. He held onto her shoulder and let her lift one foot at a time to take off his boots, socks, and the rest of his uniform. She gazed back up at him. Daniel, my love? His eyes were glassy and wet. He shook his head. Tell me what else to do, Daniel, she begged. He didn't move. He opened his mouth as if it were an effort to do so. Take the rest off. His voice barely registered above a whisper. Yours too. Nina tilted her head. Daniel didn't look like he wanted to make love right now, nor was he even hard, but she did as he asked. He raised his arms over his head to help her take his shirt off. He was shivering. She slid his boxers down past his ankles and again lifted one foot at a time for her to pull them off. She remained in a squat at his feet. She reached around, pulled her shirt and bra off, and peered up. She wasn't sure how to read him. Daniel looked down at her with no expression whatsoever. Tell me what to do, she implored. He didn't say anything. Nina sighed, stood, and pulled her jeans, panties, socks, and boots off in a couple of expedient zips and shoves. Now what? She asked. When he still said nothing, she steered him toward the bathroom. So we have here some rising action. They're undressing. And it's still a tense moment, even though he's very passive. Actually, because he's passive, we don't know what he's going to do, what's going to happen necessarily. But she takes control and she steers him into the bathroom. And the tension mounts from here. And notice this is the longest part of the scene. Picture that down again. In the shower, she turned Daniel to face the wall and massaged body wash over his shoulders, around his armpits, and along his back. He passively allowed her to shampoo the dust, sediment, and spiderweb threads from his hair. Murky water mixed with artificially flower-scented body wash made tributaries over the lines of his muscles, pooled around the drain, and slid away. Nina guided him to lean back on the tile wall and then proceeded to work on the front of his body. She gently soaped his neck, sliding her fingers past his throat and along the collarbones. He closed his eyes as she lathered one arm and then the other. As she spread more body wash over his chest and abdomen, the only sound was of the water spraying over them and against the walls and floor. She avoided his genitals and focused on his thighs. Even though the proximity and pressure of her hands obviously aroused him, he still rested against the wall with his arms dangling at his sides. He didn't crouch to meet her or put his hands on her head. Remembering his admonition about using sex as a distraction from difficulties, she continued. He offered neither resistance nor help when she sat on the floor to lift one foot, then the other. "You're clean," she said when she rose. She kissed him and started to clean herself. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back to wet her hair, trying to think of something to say. Nina lingered to let the hot water drench her hair. Daniel moved behind her. He kneaded his fingers around her temples and up to the top of her head. His heart beat steadily into her back when he pulled her back to his chest. Nina didn't dare say anything. She reminded herself to breathe and not to turn to embrace him, letting him take the lead. Daniel slid his lips along the side of her neck and her shoulder. He wrapped his arms more firmly around her and she let her head fall against him. She relaxed but didn't respond. He could do whatever he wanted to her. She wanted him to come back from wherever he was right now. The tension is still mounting here. They can still walk away from this, right? She can take a step forward. He may or may not pull her back again. He hasn't really done that much to her. So we move along to a crisis moment. Daniel continued to move his lips along Nina's upper back and over to the other shoulder. She barely registered them for the lightness of his touch and the water raining over them. His lips were soft. He slid his hands up Nina's rib cage and abdomen to cup her breasts. She purposely slowed her breath because his fingers that close to her nipples made her want to reach for him. She pressed harder against his chest and his erection grew and settled toward the top of her buttocks. Now we're at the point of no return. Now they have to actually have sex. And I've left that part out of this scene. The actual sex act itself is really going to depend on the heat level you're going for. So we want to go back to those bits of advice about the length of the scene, about how well we know the characters, about how well we know the genre and the audience we're writing for. And from there we have the falling action and resolution again. "Oh, Nina," Daniel whimpered when she faced him again. She soaped up her hands and lathered them both as she kissed him. He pressed his lips back on hers only a little bit. The water cooled, but they rested in each other's arms against the wall for another minute or two. "We'll figure this out," she offered again and kissed his chin. "I know." Daniel smiled, but his voice cracked. So the sex scene in this scene actually goes on for quite a while because my books are more of a romantic erotica kind of theme than plain old straight up romance. But there's obviously a lot of subtext here. So what is the scene really about? We know that Daniel is horrified and in shock over what he discovered just before this scene happened. And a lot of this is about how he's feeling. Even though it's from Nina's perspective, it's very much about his emotions as well. We also see here Nina's uncertainty about how to handle Daniel's mood. She's asking him questions, what do I do? She remembers that her particular skill set and her usual go-to for feeling better is something he expressly said that he does not want. And so she kind of figures it out and fumbles along. We also can see from here that Daniel is in a fragile state and that he might have some hang-ups. We see this especially in the sex scene itself because some things happen and he says a thing or two that are out of character usually for him, and she notices because of that. Now, I'll add here that I was able to put that out of character moment and a little bit of dialogue in because Nina found it strange. And the reader was able to go with it that way because the reader knows that the character knows this is not the usual kind of thing. We also see here Daniel and Nina's inability to communicate clearly, which is an underlying theme throughout the rest of the book. They're still trying to work out the language they use around one another. They don't know what to say to each other, and so they say nothing, and the body language does most of the work here, which is the point of that sex scene. So to review the basics of writing a sex scene, we need to keep in mind the following. Use real names, real words, or very, very common nicknames. You can say cock instead of penis, but I wouldn't go beyond much otherwise than that with the throbbing members and the usual kinds of cliches we see. There are a lot of verbs in both scenes. Make sure you keep that scene moving and the tension and the pace moving along. There is minimal dialogue. Both of them, there is dialogue, both scenes, but only enough to move the next part of the scene forward. Nothing beyond that. There isn't a deep conversation. There are also minimal descriptors and adverbs and adjectives. We see it more in the D.H. Lawrence scene, but that was a different style of writing, and it's not generally looked upon well now, although as you've seen, it can work. You can make those adjectives and adverbs work, but usually people slip into telling instead of showing when we start using those words. What we saw instead were concrete sensory details a lot of the time. We could visualize what was happening pretty easily in both those scenes. Also, we need to think about reader expectations. The amount of tension you build behind the actual sex should determine how you write the scene itself. The more tension you build, the more explosive that trigger point is, probably the more detailed and fast-paced you're going to want to make the actual sex. Mine, again, is an erotica scene, so it's very detailed, but it needn't have been that way. I could have condensed some of the tension, and I could have closed the door to the bathroom and just gone to the resolution with a few sentences. But even with this level of detail that I do use, the tension continues to ratchet up. And finally, just like in real life, just like with real sex, not all readers are going to be satisfied every single time. People are very particular about what they want and expect from their sex scenes. And the best you can do is write the best scene that you can write. Write the one that's the most appropriate and well crafted, and worry about what the audience thinks of it afterward. So in closing, fight and sex scenes are primarily about communication. And they're also about connection. So it's communication and connection between the characters in a way that deepens our understanding about them or the overall work of fiction. And we're also developing a relationship, not just between the characters, but between you and the reader. The reader is going to keep staying invested by understanding more and more and more about these people. Sex and violence also need to do something with the character, or they can introduce something to the plot. There can be something about the sex that moves the plot forward, the fact that they have it, the fact that something happens during it, but something important has to have happened. And it can also introduce something important to the characters or about the characters, but one or the other generally has to happen. We need either deeper insight into the plot or deeper insight into the characters when we have sex scenes especially. And they should also support some major theme in the book if you can. It doesn't have to be the big major theme, but some element of it should be there so that it feels natural and like it belongs in the book. In terms of techniques, remember that specific sequences of movements and events need to be there. They need to mimic that classic upside down checkmark shape of a narrative work. They also need to be sequential. So the actions need to happen on the page the same way they would in real life if we were watching them play out. And as an extension of this rule, cause and effect needs to be very firmly in place. That cause and effect pattern is what sets the pacing a lot of the time. So it's good to have some mastery over that. And we want to stay in active voice as much as possible, partly because that helps us stay in sequential order and helps us stay with cause and effect, as we saw with Kathy and Sheila. But sometimes there's a good reason to use passive voice. As long as you're doing it deliberately, then it should be fine. Again, writing doesn't have any hard, fast rules. These are just things that I've discovered as I've been writing. And finally, sentences are generally short with these scenes, and there's transitions between the sentences that keep the momentum moving forward again. Again, even with the slightly longer sentences in Lawrence or even mine, they're not so complicated that they have to be reread necessarily. So thank you very much for joining me, and I hope this presentation will prove helpful to you as you continue your own writing adventure. If you'd like to find out more about me or my work, my website is www.karenjanowsky.com, and you can also find my blog there. I have a new blog up just about every month. The Persistence of Memory series is available on Amazon, both in ebook and paperback form. And you can also find my Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest pages on my website. I love talking about reading and writing, so please feel free to join my mailing list when you go to my website and strike up a conversation with me. Again, on behalf of the Write Women's Book Festival, be well and thank you again.